It isn't hard to imagine a world where you and everyone you know can be destroyed without warning at a push of a button. This was an actuality for many people during a period of 13 days known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world came closest to nuclear devastation. Three major people to remember in this conflict are former US President John F. Kennedy, former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and Prime Minister of Cuba and later President of Cuba Fidel Castro. Though allied in World War II, after the defeat of Nazi Germany and the disagreement on the future of Germany, the United States and the Soviet Union became bitter rivals who constantly competed for dominance over the other. In 1946, Germany was divided into two. The Soviet Union controlled the East Bloc and the Western Bloc was controlled by the US and Western Allies. A key part of their rivalry was the nuclear arms race. Both nations expanded their nuclear arsenal, and in October 1959, to deter invasion attempts from the Soviets, the US placed nuclear-tipped Jupiter missiles in Turkey, located approximately 150 miles from the Soviet Union. This move threatened the Soviet Union, but an opportunity to get even with America soon arose. In 1959, the Cuban state was liberated by Fidel Castro and a group of Cuban rebels from the corrupt dictator Fulgencio Batista. However, Fidel Castro turned out to be a communist, making his takeover change Cuba into a communist state. This change was welcomed by the Soviet Union, whom themselves are based on communism.
The United States is really the only guardian gate against communist advance. The responsibility is heavy on us.
America was and still is a very anti-communist country, so automatically they weren't pleased with the fact that a communist state was right at their borders. The President of America at that time, Dwight Eisenhower, placed an embargo on Cuba and decided that Fidel Castro had to be taken care of. So he authorized the CIA to create and sponsor a group of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. This group was known as Brigade 2506. Dwight Eisenhower could not see the invasion mission through since his term ended and JFK became president. However, the invasion plan still proceeded, and on April 17, 1961, the invasion plan was launched from Nicaragua to the Bay of Pigs on the coast of Cuba. In a span of 24 hours, over 100 of the exiles were killed, and more than 1,100 were captured. This was a big loss for America and a huge win for Castro. JFK was blamed for the failure of this mission since he did not provide the rebels air support, believing such an act would show America's involvement in the invasion. Nevertheless, America's involvement was revealed, and after the invasion attempt, Fidel Castro was convinced that he needed military support from the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev swiftly agreed and secretly started sending nuclear missiles and military equipment to Cuba. His reasons for doing this was to counteract US missiles that were in Turkey and to have a bargaining chip to force West Berlin into joining East Germany. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane took multiple photos of nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. The following day, the U.S. intelligence personnel analyzed the plane's data and found out that the Soviets were building medium-range ballistic missile sites in Cuba. President Kennedy was briefed on the present situation. Secret meetings were held by President Kennedy and a group of government officials later known as the Executive Committee of National Security Council, or EXCOM for short. These meetings were secretly recorded by President Kennedy. During these meetings, the President and the EXCOM discussed options to deal with the missiles in Cuba. These options consisted of inaction, diplomacy, airstrikes, invasion, and a blockade. The majority of military personnel pushed for a full-scale invasion into Cuba. JFK, however, did not favor any aggressive moves, believing such an action would make America look like, in his own words, trigger-happy cowboys, and give the Soviets a justifiable reason to overrun West Berlin. A U-2 spy plane discovered intermediate-range ballistic missile sites in Cuba. This made matters worse since such a missile could virtually reach almost any state in North America. President Kennedy decided on the naval blockade but changes the name to a quarantine, since the term blockade was an act of war. On the following day, the U.S. military alert is placed on DEFCON 3, and the U.S. Navy was authorized to place a blockade on Cuba, and that same afternoon, Kennedy publicly announced the situation with Cuba and his plans for the blockade.
Directing that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine of all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound to Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Most Americans, after hearing the news, were worried for their safety. The speech placed them in a state of deep concern. The U.S. Navy moved in to put a blockade on Cuba. Some of the Soviet vessels challenged the blockade, but most of the ships with military supplies turned around. U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted Soviets about missiles in Cuba at the United Nations, and conflict between U.S. and Soviet vessels built to a dangerous level, and for the first time in U.S. history, the Strategic Air Command is placed at DEFCON 2, a state of military readiness one step away from nuclear warfare. Letters were sent back and forth from the White House to the Kremlin as both leaders tried to communicate and reason with one another, knowing any blunder could potentially mean a nuclear holocaust for this world. On the following day, Fidel Castro sent a letter to Nikita Khrushchev urging him to launch a nuclear strike against the U.S. Nikita Khrushchev ignores this letter and sends a message to JFK with an offer to end the crisis, asking the U.S. to lift the quarantine and pledge not to invade Cuba in exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles from the island of Cuba. The 12th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis dawned with the U.S. and the Soviet Union on the brink of nuclear confrontation. That morning, a Soviet ship was hit by depth charges from a U.S. Navy ship, which wanted the submarine to surface. The people on the submarine thought war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. This decision had to be made by 3 officials. 2 of them agreed, but Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command, refused and saved the day. The plane of Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. was shot down out of the Cuban sky by a Soviet missile. This death made both powers realize things were getting out of control. Nikita Khrushchev sent a second message implying that any proposed deal must have the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey. After a tense discussion with the ex-com, JFK ignores Khrushchev's second message and responded to the first message instead. Kennedy wrote a message to Khrushchev with steps to remove missiles from Cuba and a pledge to not invade Cuba. This critical message was sent through his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to finalize this compromise. Robert Kennedy indicated that America was already planning to remove their missiles in Turkey, but the removal of the missiles in Turkey could not reach the public's ears and must be kept secret. The Soviets began to dismantle their missiles by November 1962, and on the following April, the U.S. removed their missiles from Turkey. Obviously, having no voice in this compromise, a lesson Cuba drew from the crisis was not to trust neither superpower, hence the deterioration of Soviet-Cuban relations after the crisis. The U.S. kept their promise to not invade Cuba and lifted the blockade. However, the embargo on Cuba stayed and is still active to this very day. After bringing the world so close to the abyss of destruction, a hotline was established between the White House and the Kremlin for better communication. Both nations began to take some control over their nuclear weapons, and in less than a year after the crisis ended, representatives of the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Limited Nuclear Test Treaty ban. The 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis is without a doubt one of the most dangerous periods in the history of man. If the people involved in this crisis did not try to find a compromise to this grave conflict and allow things to escalate, the world we know today would be drastically different. The Cuban Missile Crisis will forever hold importance in history as a lesson on the dangers of nuclear weapons, the insecurity of world peace and affairs, and the complex art of conflict and compromise.